One of the films which most enchants me and rivets me is the Coen's masterpiece Barton Fink, which I consider almost certainly to be their best feature, possibly far and away their greatest work. This may sound a tinge balmy, although I have to be honest and note that Barton Fink is one of the most thoroughly enjoyable, watchable, and compelling films I can put on. Now, that is partly because I know the film really well. I watched it a half dozen times in my late adolescence, and even though I'm not sure if I ever rewatched the film beyond the age of, say, 20, seeing it again had me completely realizing why I viewed it so many times then. As I was watching it, I realized that up to 35 minutes of the runtime had gone by without my at all realizing it. I had assumed we were about 20 minutes into the feature. Few features are more captivatingly beguiling, just seductively luring you into its abundant mysteries. A scaffold derived from Polanski, presumably fueled by a stream of consciousness writing procedure, anxieties about inauthenticity, political applications of artistic forms, and the motivations of escape desire, and the representations which motivate a desire for changes, fluxus, and an evolving of the existing paradigms. Much has been made and said of what Barton Fink is attempting to be an illustration of, the most telling decision in the film being John Goodman's Charlie Meadows slash Karl Mund vocalizing a Hail Hitler before he shoots dead one of the law enforcement officers hoping to bring him a wanted murderer to justice. It may be difficult to separate Barton Fink's prospective purpose from a Jewish existential anxiousness. His impassioned efforts to distill an art for the regular workers of the American ecosystem are eventually ridiculed as being abstracted, possibly elitist, and a moral justification for working within one's head rather than with one's calloused hands. The tension between the continuum of high art, its attributes and noble endeavours of expression and distillation, and the by comparison streamlined nature of the arts of the labouring masses, this is an omnipresent battle which persists today. It is quite possible that Barton Fink does not want to work, suffer as so many of his fellow Americans do daily, and seeks to compose his art as a remedial alternative, his works reflecting his desire to liberate all others from that trap, though also offering him a convenient way out of doing any of this martyring labour himself. Barton's insistence on the purity of high art, or his implied scorn for so-called low art, might display a class divide, prospective elitism in of itself, though he is quick to disdain the high art, which is dissimilar to his own, which dispels his work, he believes, a more political conviction. Fink presumably thinks that the mass-produced media for the average American is rather condescending them, dumbed-down triviality produced for low-cost, easy constructions and straightforwardly relatable, wanting to merge the gap between the media which is made for the masses and which the masses love, and the more apparently accomplished, ambitious, and exploratory works of art which may have a genuine intellectual aspiration to them, and may even be extremely profound, impressive, and accomplished, but are alienating to a common viewer of the work. Fink finds himself being perceived as quite inconsistent by those who are interacting with him. Barton's romanticization of the authenticity of working class existence could be seen as in itself condescending and snootily elitist. Actually, look at his interactions with his neighbour, knowing how the film concludes. And maybe you will speculate to what degree Goodman's character thinks Fink is speaking down to him, but politely forgiving this, keeping his frustration to himself. They cut back to Meadows a lot, even when he's not speaking, and Barton speaking, and you hear him just off frame, and Meadows almost seems annoyed at times. It's not something I picked up on immediately, and why would you? You don't really think about why. You're just engrossed in the film. They're just cutting back and forth. You don't really think. You think, wait a minute, there's a reason they did. Anyway, beyond simply a diatribe on the class divide, as I had inferred earlier, those around Barton are unable to assess him as a human. Most of them are quick to point out his apparent Jewishness. Interestingly, Goodman's character is a potential exception, and his expressed antipathy for Barton, if we want to call it that, doesn't emerge from a Christian-rooted prejudice against another established unit, as the police investigators seem to represent, an institutionalized dislike of Jewish identity, which is tied in with their notions of toughness and masculinity, downstream of a domineering European and English, then American, cultural precepts. Or certainly not from a cultural supremacy or self-hating disposition, as Lipnick appears to espouse. He uses the K word more than any other character in the film, and has no qualms about vocalizing solidarity with the lowest common denominator factors within American culture. Whereas Goodman's character, Meadows or Munt, feels an inevitable consternation for the privileged bourgeoisie, which really threatens to manifest as anti Semitic bigotry, and whilst his actions are ultimately the most violent, he keeps quiet on this to the audience and to Barton, possibly because he does not truly feel this way about a certain block of his fellow humans, just feels contempt for the bourgeois bracket in general, and possibly because his grievances, from the Coen's perspective, weren't worth reducing to banal racism and instead rooted in a deep anger at perceived elitism and deliberate distancing that certain areas of society attempt to place away from others, possibly a majority of others, within that very society. Meadows' Munt was a golem which initially could have protected Barton from the wider prejudicial society. Meadows' Munt is well aware as to what the police will do to Barton if they find him with a dead young woman. But ultimately, its violence came back to haunt Barton, despite protecting him from those who attempted to imprison him, making Barton feel normal and safe, and being his companion in a world which seems so indifferently isolating. Barton, at least in his mind, the life of a mind, attempted to mould Charlie Meadows into his idea of the common man, and it did protect him from scrutiny in a disdainful society, but it could not protect him from shame as the golem's wave of violence, the vicious scorn of other Jews who had willfully assimilated, or from the golem's possibly harming its creator's loved ones, either an envious offspring bitter at the affection Barton shows for others, or just paranoia on Barton's end, rooted in an unshakable, subdued contempt for what he calls the common man. In this respect, I am reminded of George Steiner's The Portage to San Cristobal of A.H., in which a literary hypothetical Hitler is recovered from escaped exile in the South American jungle, is given a trial in the midst of the wilderness when it becomes apparent that he is close to death and the aircraft will not arrive in time to take him to a more recognized court. When the literary Hitler is given a chance to speak in his defense, what follows is one of the most controversial passages in the history of English literature. In proceeding to justify his actions, citing the existence prior of a supposed Jewish superiority complex, of previous utopian endeavours, a lack of uniqueness where his own mass murders were concerned, and, subsequently, his violence is enabling, so he claims, of the newly recreated state of Israel. Steiner himself claimed, years after the book's publishing in 1981, to have gone too far, and that he had created a golem which, in attempting to safeguard the Jewish people by establishing the unequivocal evil of a figure like Hitler, came back to haunt the Jewish ethos and reflect on them negatively in the eyes of a supposed God. A diatribe on the nature of socialism's relationship with fascism, an exploration into the idea of escape, representation as escape, and the possibly inevitable elitism of attempting to distinguish oneself as an author, a social advocate, or as Jewish, or just a series of scenes which the Coens felt innately compelled or motivated to compose, the significance inherent but not overt, like a dream might appear, not dissimilar to how Barton himself penned his screenplay in the grip of fever and determination to espouse all his concerns for the world around him. The more subtle mystery in the film is that of Barton's potential ego. To what degree can we ascribe a sense of superiority or elitism in Barton's actions? Is he entirely innocent and well-meaning, or espousing a class condescension which he cannot hope to escape? One's perception of Barton's ego is vital to their ultimate opinion on the film's function itself. Is Barton out of touch, attempting to disguise his bourgeois ambitions in life, or is he a victim of a scornful, resentful society around him, which refuses to accept his socially progressive aspirations out of loyalty to the pre-existing systems, out of binary notions of fixed class identity, or due to factors which are beyond Barton's or anyone else's control and rooted in viciously irrational prejudices? One's assessment of Barton's character is a window into one's own character. The source of Barton's inspiration, the contents of that box, are literally whatever we, the audience, decides that it is. My own perspective is that Barton was not egotistical and meant well, for a variety of reasons. One, Barton does not live in luxury, doesn't appear to desire to, and is more absolving himself of potentially higher class origins than a continually materially privileged existence. Two, he does a lot more than most prospective champagne socialists to make a difference in the lives of average workers, interacting with at least one of them. Most of them wouldn't dare, not without wearing a furbished hazmat suit, and wanting his art to enchant them and dismissing the established print critics. And thirdly, he desperately wants to find that middle ground between dumbed down, condescending media composed for the masses, enjoyed by the masses in the short time, but objectively stagnating their possibly mundane existences, socio-politically, economically, culturally, and bridging the gap between that and what he perhaps aptly describes as the hollow formalism of more, say, bourgeois art, designed to impress critics and to distinguish itself from the world of the masses. The appeal of this art being in its exclusivity, esotericism, and ability to alienate the average observer, which grants some superficial sense of superiority in the mind of that work's vapid admirers. It is also worth mentioning that I have known the egotistical and self-adoring in this real world, and Barton is just simply not one of them. Actually, he's not even close. There are those who like supposedly classier forms of media because they like the idea of feeling superior to the average individual. They don't enjoy the idea of a majority of people appreciating the work. They like that it seems to mark them as unique. They cannot get over the feeling of being super special, that their irresponsible mummies influenced upon them at too young an age. Not that anyone deserves to be coddled at any age, or not uniquely so. Though likely even if all of us were coddled from the beginning of time, that might be a disaster. It would lead to an inevitable competition of who is superior, not an imbalanced mess of those who were raised in modesty and those who were raised to think that they were better than the other kids. I used to interact with this one individual, also on YouTube, without getting into it too much. I think that parents ought to be banned from excessively praising or otherwise spoiling their kids. No one ought to wake up in the morning thinking that they're amazing, or at least not uniquely amazing. Either we all are or none of us are. And I don't know a single person exists within that excessive positive self-esteem pathos who doesn't just low-key think of themselves as superior to the average person. The point is, one ought to try and relate to as many people as possible, and those who reject this, whether from a snooty pseudo-left position of enjoying feeling smarter and better than everyone else, or from a more tell it like it is, proudly crass and bullying, supposedly down-to-earth perspective, are expressing a superiority complex, whether they realize it or not. The upper middle class and lower upper class left, which is most of the left, depressingly, is open about its superiority complex, to be slightly fair, but aggressively contemptuous to them. Most people in that bracket are left-wing to appear morally superior to their bourgeois peers, not because their fathers had to mow lawns for a living, and so to them, social and economic change is generally dismissed compared with the finer luxury of coming across as noble and obnoxiously righteous on social media. But a lot of people, too, might dismiss Barton Fink for perceiving it as belonging to that world of supposedly higher society, a bit bourgeoisie, not that they know the term even, and not being down-to-earth enough, crass enough, or just didactic enough. The average arrested development adolescent or adolescent, more interested in social status and not being perceived as lame than in acting remotely virtuously whatsoever, whenever, at any point, no, they won't get it. The average working adult male, unless they are an arrested development adolescent, will absolutely get what Barton Fink's script is attempting to communicate to an audience. My father, the lawnmower man, he happened to come across me watching Barton Fink. The second half of it is when he arrived, and he wound up finishing the film with me. This is one of the many times I rewatched it in my late adolescence. I think at that time, when I was 17, he got it more than I did. He was the common man Barton espoused about, still is, and it registered to him that the Coens, who he'd seen other films of, from Fargo, Lebowski, No Country, were attempting to explore the nature between the ambitious artists and the suffering workers who don't have time for intellectualizing and elevating a medium itself. Works that exist as the equivalent of potato chips and beer, and works that exist to question and challenge, to grip your mind as you go about your day subsequent to the experience. Must they be so distant from one another? Considering that I found Barton Fink more thoroughly entertaining than most films I have ever seen, from explosive action films to quippy comedies, elaborate mysteries, or visceral graphic horror exercises, I'm rather convinced that no, there's no reason, no good reason, that they have to be distanced from one another at all. And at the end of the day, I'm just some guy. I'm just some random. And so are all of you. All of you. Most dismissals of a piece of film criticism usually, or tend to, stem from an idea that the piece wasn't exclusive enough, wasn't contritely intellectual enough, wasn't affirming the claimed superiority of film enthusiasts enough. And that's why you won't want to like it. Or, conversely, someone thinks it's over-intellectual, not telling it like it is enough, which is temper tantrum reactionary, assuming that certain forms are for snooty scumbags only, and have no merit beyond affirming the intellectual presumptions of its devotees. Nothing must ever have aspirations, ever try to be more, because the bourgeois twits might embrace it and use it to affirm their egos. So no, best just keeping it dumb, or as some call it, keeping it real, and stagnate the human race until it disappears from this earth. The struggle for egalitarian ideals in an unequal environment, world society, is perhaps most succinctly articulated, cleverly represented, and originally, earnestly, uncontrived in the Coens' classic, plausibly their overall masterpiece, Barton Fink, assessing the continuum of elitist sentiment and the holier-than-thou counter-actors within and amongst our species' cultural media itself.